my dear friends Arun, Kishore, Mr. Malik, my revered parents, and dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, I must confess that I am the only Nariman who has not written a book yet. The more prolific of the two, by the way, is my mother, not my father. One can't help thinking that when one comes across great river water systems, that not only do they provide us with what all life basically requires, but they are actually cradles of civilization. I wonder how many of you have visited Rome, and if you have visited Rome, how many of you have seen Bernini's great sculpture of 1651? It is a sculpture of 4 great rivers representing 4 great continents. In 1651, Australia was not yet discovered. We begin, interestingly enough, with the great Mother Ganga. And Mother Ganga is typified by the sculptor with not only a human face, because Neptune, don't forget, was the god of water in the Roman pantheon, but with a massive oar, showing that it was a river water system which for years has been used by mankind to ferry men and goods up and down. Following the Ganga, we have another sculpture of the great Nile, which housed the great Egyptian civilization. Here, interestingly enough, we have the god Neptune with his head covered. Now it is covered because at that point of time, the source of the Nile had not yet been discovered. So it is a river system which was so massive that one could not predicate where exactly its source was. The third river, of course, is the great river of Europe, the Danube. And along with the Danube, you have the then pontiff, who was Innocent X, his particular coat of arms, to show that it's the river closest to the papacy. And the fourth river, interestingly enough, was the river Plate. So always wonder, why did he choose the river Plate? That is answered because not only is the Plate in South America and nowhere near the other great river systems in the north, but apparently he chose it because he put silver coins next to it. Because at that point of time, he thought this is a place where you could go and find El Dorado. Don't ever forget, the river Plate is interesting for another reason. When World War II began, in December 1939, one of the first engagements of the World War was the Battle of the River Plate. How does it affect India? There were 3 British cruisers that stood outside Montevideo Harbour to dog the German pocket battleship, the Graf Spee. One of them was the HMS Achilles, which after the war became our flagship and became the INS Delhi. And apparently that INS Delhi has now been disbanded, and you find some parts of it in the yacht club in India. But coming back to the great river systems and coming back to Keshore's outstanding book, why do I say it's outstanding? Obviously, he's put an enormous amount of thought into it. In the very first chapter, he describes water in Roman law terms, which is very interesting. He calls it res communis and res nullius. Now, these concepts show that even if you try and hold water in the palm of your hand, it slips out. What he has then traced is our Government of India Act, Constitution, etc., all of which continue this Roman law concept to show that ultimately it is user alone of this great national resource which can be controlled or regulated. It cannot be owned. What also tickled me in one sense was the fact that Kishore's reading was not confined to river water systems at all. I found that each chapter was headed with a quotation from very, very diverse sources. For example, and I want to read each one of them to you. The very first chapter which deals with water is from a quotation by Albert Georgi. Now, as most of you know, Albert Georgi won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1937, having discovered vitamin C, which was crucial not only for most of us, but crucial for sailors particularly, because that alone cured scurvy. Apart from many other things that this great man did, he donated the entire prize money for the benefit of Finland, which had suffered at that point of time, thanks to Nazi occupation. Now, Georgi has a quote which says, "Water, the hub of life. Water is life's mater and matrix, mother and medium. There is no life without water." Similarly, he begins chapter 2 with a quote from Genesis, the Bible itself. The quote goes this way: "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God said, 'Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place. And let the dry land appear,' and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good." Beautiful. I would exhort those of you who haven't read Genesis to now go and please read it. Chapter 38 in particular is a little known chapter, which deals with a very interesting story of a man called Judah, who gave his name to an entire nation, and how ultimately it was with, he turned a widower, and his daughter-in-law Tamar equally was a widow twice over, because both his sons who married her died, and he promised her to the third son, didn't keep his promise. Ultimately, there is a very piquant point in the book where he actually goes into Tamar, who is now dressed as a prostitute, he doesn't know, and then as father-in-law produces a pair of twins. One of the twins is called Perez, after the great Shimon Peres, which we've all heard of. And it is from Perez that apparently Jesus Christ himself is descended in the direct line of descent. This leaves Genesis, and we come now to chapter 3, where once again Kishore's reading is extremely wide. Who does he quote? He quotes the then Secretary of State for India, John Morley. As you know, the Minto-Morley reforms of 1909 led for the first time to self-governing provinces in India. It also led to separate electorates for the Muslims for the first time. Legislative powers were enlarged, and the very first Indian, a man called Satyendra Sinha, was appointed for the first time to the Viceroy's Governing Council. Now, from John Morley, who later became first Viscount Morley of Blackburn, the quote is, "Evolution is not a force but a process, not a cause but a law." The fourth chapter, which is the present, has a very interesting quote again from a little-known author. He is not to be confused with a clergyman of the same name who lived a little before him. But he was a physician in the time of George I, Thomas Fuller. He had a compendium called Nomologia, which he published in 1732. And interestingly enough, one of these aphorisms, because there are a number of them which I want to read to you, Kishore has picked up. The aphorism here is, we never know the worth of water till the well is dry. Fuller was also very famous for statements like the following: beware of telling an improbable truth. Now, all lawyers beware. Get the facts, or the facts will get you. And when you get them right, or they will get you wrong. All things are difficult before they are easy. And fourth, Bacchus, that is the god of wine, hath drowned more men than Neptune, the god of water. This brings to mind Justice Krishna immediately, because Justice Krishna had both Bacchus as well as Neptune in two separate judgments. Bacchus first, P.N. Kaushal versus the Union of India. There is a sentence describing drunkards thus, if I remember right. They take reeling, rolling trips in the realms of the Jocos, Beliocos, Lacrymos, and Comatos. And now Neptune. Neptune is again dealt with in the great Samsher Singh judgment, where he speaks of the Westminster model and where he says in his inimitable language that it is not the Potomac, Washington, but the Thames, London, which has fertilized the Yamuna, which is Delhi, in order to produce the Westminster model. Now, with this, we come to the last chapter. And here again, Kishore quotes from Coleridge, the famous Ancient Mariner, which all of you must have either read or done in school, done in college, whatever. And it's the famous water, water everywhere. And all the bogs did shriek, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Apart from the book itself, which is a great study, these little clues tell us something about the author. And I was very gladdened to see that the author's depth and width of reading have also somehow or the other enlivened these pages. Before I end, I must give my dearest friend Vinod Bobde, to whom this book is dedicated, a very, very fond, I won't call it remembrance, because even though he is not with us physically, he is with us otherwise. Vinod and I go back to our, at least my early days of practice when I came here in 1986. At that point of time, both of us shared in common two extremely interesting persons as godfathers. One was the late Balmukund Agarwal, and the other was the late Justice A.P. Sen. Balmukund Agarwal was perhaps the best read man I have come across in my life. I remember his taking me around his library for the first time, and I picked up some book by Stefan Zweig, with which I was reasonably familiar, The Tide of Fortune. And I remember just asking him, when did you buy this? So he noted it by date. After which he began telling me about the book in great detail, one after the other. I remember the first story dealt with the head upon the rostrum, which was Cicero's death. The second was the fall of Byzantium. He related all these two, one after the other. And I realized then what a great bibliophile this man was. Unfortunately, I didn't know him long enough, but we got very close before he died. And both his sons have given me his entire library. They've given it to me. And I hope that when I retire at the age of 65, I will sit down and systematically devour as many of those books as I can. Justice A.P. Sen, again, was a father figure to both Vinod and myself in court. I remember I had come to court because I had nothing really to do. And Vinod was involved in some litigation between landlord and tenant which had come from Allahabad. And Justice Sen was hearing it. The facts ran something like this. Vinod appeared for the tenant. There was some old bungalow with a lot of land around it. And the tenant had been evicted down the line. But what was also pointed out was that none of the landlord's children, the landlord was dead by then, ever came to the bungalow except to visit it during their vacations. So Vinod had suggested some halfway house which the other side had accepted. Justice A.P. Sen saw me sitting in court, called me to the front and appointed me amicus curiae only in order to look up the law under Article 136, which law ought to tell the judge that whatever the two may say between themselves, it doesn't bind the judge. So I went, looked up what I could over the weekend. The judge had also warned me, and I still remember. He said, don't forget to see page 80 of that SLP. Because at that page, the tenant is described as a political bigwig. So he thought there was some arm twisting involved here. On the Tuesday which followed, we all came to court. I came armed with several authorities. And most unfortunately for Justice Sen, the first question he asked me was, what do you think of the compromise? So being young and inexperienced, I blurted out and said, I think it's completely fair. He said, oh, you think it's fair? It's almost like, why did I appoint you, you idiot? So I immediately tried to backtrack at that point and said, yes, but I've also looked up the law. The moment he said, or he saw that I thought it was fair, look at his discipline. He thought it was most unfair. He immediately dictated an order thanking me for being amicus, said that the amicus thinks it fair, and therefore the compromise should be taken on record. The second incident which involved Vinod and myself, which comes to light, there are so many, was Vinod's extreme brilliance as a lawyer and an advocate. Here again, there was a judgment of the late Justice Sabyasachi Mukherjee on some water cess. And it came before a 3-judge bench headed by Justice Kuldeep Singh, who, as you know, wasn't one of our more patient judges. And I got up and I said, I think this judgment is right, I don't know why it's been referred. And the municipal corporation was then represented by Bhimrao Nayak, who got up and tried to show the judge that it was wrong. He got to argue for about 20 minutes or so, didn't make any headway. And just as the judge was about to dismiss it, Vinod got up. So he asked Vinod, who are you appearing for? So he said, I am also for the corporation. So he said, you know that one advocate has... He said, of course I know. And I must tell you, Vinod is one of the most disciplined advocates. But he said, I feel a little strongly in this case, so I just want to tell you something which I don't think has been pointed out. And I won't take more than a minute. Now, Vinod, with his grace, was able to get a judge like Justice Kuldeep Singh to listen to him, equally graceful. In the first minute, I realized that there was going to be trouble. In the second minute, I realized that my number was up. And in the third minute, yes, Mr. Nariman, and I couldn't answer. And that judgment got reversed. This is Vinod's brilliance. He did it in virtually 5 sentences, wrapped the entire thing up. Having gone down memory lane and seeing my very dear friends on the dais and other dear friends sitting here, I can only tell you that this book will fill a great void in our legal literature. and I exhort all of you to buy it and read it. Quite apart from the lovely quotes, it is truly a masterpiece. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nariman, for such a brilliant address. Though we were slated to have the closing remarks and vote of thanks by Mr. Lahiri, the author, but we have tinkered with the format. Instead of closing remarks, Mr. Sumit Malik will put a few questions to the author, Mr. K.K. Lahiri, on the lines of in conversation with the author. Thereafter, Mr. Lahiri will give his vote of thanks to our guests. Mr. Sumit.
Mr. Lahiri, considering that your primary passion is arbitration, how is it that you wrote a book on interstate water disputes?
So let me begin by forewarning you. The author full of the book is not what the audience wants, so I'm going to be very brief in my answers. I hope that's okay. Actually, interesting question you put to me, Smith. This is a question which many a colleague has asked me after they got the invite for this book release. And really there are two reasons for it. One is a matter of timing. I really got involved with interstate water disputes about a decade and a half earlier than arbitration. Kapil put me on the interstate river water disputes in the Ravivyas tribunal. Arbitration, I really got into the nitty-gritty about the late 90s after liberalization and after the new act came in 96. So one was the question of timing. The other was the question of need. If you look at arbitration, you more than anybody else will know there is a plethora of literature on legal literature on arbitration. Whether commentaries under the old Act of 1940, new Act of 1996, English Act, International Commercial Arbitration. But here for 60 years, from 1956 till date, we had no commentary, no comprehensive commentary on the interstate water, the disputes act. Yes, AIR manual had some things. Volume 29.2 of Osbury's Laws of India has something, but that's just not enough. So really these were the two reasons, and the second was the more important reason.
And what would you consider to be the USP of your book, and how is it structured? And where do you think this heading in the future?
Well, there's three questions in one, so we'll wrap it up with this. I'll try to be as brief as possible. USP, well, in spite of sounding like I'm blowing my own trumpet, probably the first comprehensive commentary on this act and the rules dealing with it section by section. That is the USP. And this is in chapter 4, that is the core of the book. And that is really what the book is about. As far as the structure of the book and where water disputes are headed, I've dealt with the third part of your question in chapter 5, which is captured in the future. But as far as the structure is concerned, I've summarized it in my preface. The first chapter, because Rohinton dealt with, Justice Nariman dealt with some of the quotes before the chapters. The first chapter deals with water, that is flowing or running water, proprietary or other rights in such water since Roman times. Then I have gone to the English law on the subject, then dealt with Indian law. This chapter actually was not an original part of the book. This Vinod got me to add, because he felt it was a little incomplete unless I added the chapter. Chapter 2 is titled Genesis, and that is where the quote which just Nariman read was from the Genesis. This covers the period from 1935 to 1950, that is from the enactment of the Government of India Act 1935 to the adoption of the Constitution of India. I'm sort of using my preface as a refresher. So, this chapter is titled Genesis, gesturing towards the origin of the current framework, because my stand is, what I posit is that the Act of 56 originated from the Government of India Act 1935, then to the draft Constitution, then leading to Article 262 under which this Act was legislated. The third chapter is captioned Evolution, and therefore again what Justice Nariman read was that quote on evolution. Here I deal with the evolution of the 1956 Act from its enactment in 56 through the various amendments of 57, 68, 80, 86, 2002, and the framing of the rules in 1959. The fourth chapter, which I call the core of the book is the present. Here I've analyzed the book. The fifth chapter answers your